Hello, I'm Anne Montgomery, Editor-in-Chief of BioProcess International magazine. I'm here at Biotech Week in Boston speaking with several thought leaders about advancements in bioprocessing and cell therapy development. I hope you enjoy their insights and their visions for the future.
Hello, my name is David Brindley. I have an interesting background. I'm part academic, part industrial. So my academic appointments are at Oxford, Harvard and Stanford, where my interests are in bioprocessing, regulation and intellectual property, and in particular the convergence of them. On the industrial part of my career, I run a consulting company called IP Asset Ventures, where we help companies with their CMC packages and also their IP strategy as they move towards the market at all stages, whether that be from preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And then I'm also Chief Scientific Officer of a company called Aegate, which offers a track and trace solution for supply chain in Europe and the US. So I think that academia and industry are beginning to work more effectively together, particularly in cell and gene therapy, partly by accident and partly by design. I think the design component is that it's quite clear that cell therapies require much greater clinical engagement throughout the development process than conventional small molecules or biologics, and that large CROs, for that matter CMOs, are not traditionally equipped for these issues, particularly with things like adaptive licensing and FDA breakthrough status. These fundamentally change the rate and complexity of drug development. I think that the accidental part of the increased engagement in academia and industry is simply that a lot of innovation in cell and gene therapy has originated in academia, and that's been through a partly empirical process and partly due to the almost spontaneous development of old technologies. So if we look at cell and gene therapy, you could argue that they all originate from bone marrow transplantation, which has been around for 40 plus more years. So I think the challenge now is how can academia, industry, and translation centres work effectively in this middle ground in the valley of death. And even in the middle of this valley, when we talk about translation centres, we have centres such as CCRM in Canada, the Catapult in the UK, and A-STAR in Singapore. All of them are taking a slightly different approach to tackling this challenge. Some are focused on manufacturing, some are focused on regulation, and others are focusing on nurturing young academics, postdocs, etc., so that they can then have the skills to accelerate their academic careers, but also ensure they have industrial impact. And I think that there's a phrase which is often, I think, misused in biotech, which is biotech science. And when an academic says that, that's a derogatory term, saying that biotech science, i.e. industrial science, is of a lower quality than in academia. And industrialists use it in a completely opposite way. I think now in cell and gene therapy, we're seeing biotech science is simply a continuous narrative thread of product development. And it's really encouraging to see that move forward, particularly at this conference. I think a number of regulators around the world have looked at adaptive pathways. And in Europe, it's being called the EMA adaptive licensing process, and also progressive patient access. In the US, it's really come under the FDA breakthrough status banner. But also I think that there's been a failure to appreciate two very important aspects of the regulators' support here. So firstly, there are existing programs to accelerate access. The FDA Fast Track program has been in place for a number of years. It isn't optimized for cell and gene therapy, but I think people are thinking that breakthrough status is the first time the FDA have worked to support innovation, and that isn't necessarily true. And I think the regulator has a very tough job as poacher and gamekeeper, managing risk and supporting innovation. So I think that deserves credit. I think what has differentiated the different approaches is that in the US, there's been a focus on actually what is the scientific and technical innovation here? How genuinely novel is it? What's the originality of a contribution to knowledge? And that's therefore driven things in a more almost orphan-like diseases, particularly pediatric lymphomas and leukemias, which is my area. I think that in Europe, it is probably the first time that there have been truly adaptive pathways. So moving beyond N of 1 clinician-led studies in the art of medicine, I think that the EMA breakthrough status is an astonishing step forward for Europe. And of course, the first product to get that designation was Northwest Biotherapeutics. So I think that fundamentally, the challenge for the bioprocessing community when dealing with adaptive pathways is that an adaptive pathway means in some way changes to your product, which means changes to your process. So how can you have sufficient flexibility in your development pathway, which allows flexibility in your manufacturing process, but also meeting the basic regulatory requirements of consistency, comparability, efficacy, and safety. So I think there's a number of initiatives around the world to create biotech clusters by design. And I think that the two greatest biotech clusters in the world are undoubtedly, the 128 corridor around Boston and Silicon Valley out on the West Coast. They were completely by accident, not by design. And there's a unique culture and an ecosystem which surrounds that. Part of it is the human capital, part of it is financial, and also the teaching hospitals and access to patients is critical. To a lesser extent, we've seen that in Europe. So, for example, in the UK, we talk about the golden trial of London, Oxford, and Cambridge. But in truth, I think that these regional hubs are best if they are specialised in a very deep niche. So, if you want to set up a new cluster, actually, I think it will worry less about the platform technology it's going to develop. Is it monoclonal, is it small molecule? And focus more on what is the bioprocessing problem which we're going to address here? Is this going to be a centre of manufacturing? I think saying we're going to be a centre of drug development is simply too broad. I think also when we look at the ecosystem which is required to develop a drug, it isn't all about a single nexus. I think part of the success of Boston and the Bay Area is actually that nobody has ever said that the therapy must be discovered in Longwood, manufactured in Cambridge on Mass Ave and then shipped out of Logan Airport. There has always been a very inclusive attitude, irrespective of where the innovation comes from. It's nurtured here and then as quickly as possible disseminated out. So I think an open and inclusive and collaborative approach is critical, and whether you're a new hub or an established one. Sure. I think I would give two particular examples where I think hubs are working well. I think the first one is in Toronto, really focusing around CCRM and the excellent work they've done under Mike May's leadership. I think they have excellent access to hospitals, for example, a hospital for sick children. They have great bioprocessing expertise and really, really motivated clinical network. And I hope that starts to breed successful spin-outs moving forwards. I think the second area which is really rapidly emerging in Europe is the Francis Crick Institute in London. So it will be Europe's biggest biomedical research centre, obviously literally a few yards away from some of Europe's largest teaching hospitals, and will have a large focus on cell and gene therapy. The interesting thing about the Crick Institute is that it is really focused on taking a wealth of basic science. And Paul Nurse, Nobel Prize winning scientist, is the CSO. But behind that, they've said, well, how do we take this basic science and translate it towards the clinic? So scientists are rewarded not only for publications for their careers, but also the IP, the trials, and everything else. So I think that's almost a cohesive mechanism within London and Europe more broadly.